This video looks at the answers to the Unit 3 Life on Earth Ecosystems booklet. People did really well, and I was very impressed, but we'll go through some of the answers here. So it explains here what ecology is, and then we're going to find out about ecosystems. So a species is a group of organisms that can interbreed to produce fertile offspring. The place where an organism lives is called its habitat, Habitat. The total number of organisms of the same species that live in the habitat is called population. So you can have a population of humans, you can have a population of dogs, you can have a population of dandelions, but you can't have a population of humans and dandelions because those are two different species. So population is one species, the number of that species. All of the different populations together, so all of the living things within a habitat, is called the community. So several populations, so the population of hermit crabs, velvet crabs, for example, littorina, anemones, these would be a community. Well, it's named there. The habitat populations and communities are components that make up the ecosystem. So the ecosystem is the living, so community, and non-living, or what we call the environment of the area. So living and non-living together give you an ecosystem. An ecosystem consists of the organisms, the community, living in a particular habitat, and the non-living environment with which the organisms interact. We talk in future sections about the fact that really these first three or so key areas are looking at, well, what lives in a particular area and why does it live there? So we look at the things that are what we call abiotic. So does the weather affect where a kestrel can live? Does the population density, which is a biotic factor, does that affect how many woodlice you can get under a certain rock? Or really, what is it that is deciding how many and which types of species can live in this particular area? So if we do a bit of a summary here, a species would be a group of organisms that can breed to produce fertile offspring. A habitat is a place where an organism lives. A population is all the members of one species. A community is all living organisms within an ecosystem or environment or habitat. Any of those words are actually okay. An ecosystem is the community and the environment, so the living and non-living factors. And biodiversity is the number of different species in an area. So if you think of a massive field of corn, it has potentially thousands of plants in it, millions possibly, depending on how big it is, but it's very low biodiversity because you can maybe count the number of plant species on one hand. There's very few weeds, it's mostly corn. Whereas you can have actually quite a small garden which has hundreds of different plants, hundreds of different animals, hundreds of different living organisms, fungi, bacteria, viruses, lots of things. And that's very biodiverse. So it's a number of different living species. We'll learn some ecological terms, and we keep coming back to our ecological terms as we go through the course. So we're going to look to see where producers, decomposers, predators, consumers, herbivores, prey, carnivores, omnivores go. So an organism that makes its own food is a producer. There's words like autotrophs, but we don't use those. So the organisms that make their own food are producers, and an example is any green plant. So say, for example, algae, say, for example, dandelions, whatever. Organisms that eat another organism, they consume them, they are consumers. So anything that is not what we call a herbivore, anything that is not a producer is a consumer. Organisms that eat only plants, so they are your herbivores. I don't want to see vegetarian or vegan written down in the exam. It's not the key term. It is herbivore and cows, sheep, things like that. In biology, we actually are very strict on what organisms fit in different categories. So, for example, technically a panda is a carnivore, and that's based on its dentition, its teeth, and not just what it eats. So things like cows are herbivores. Humans that only eat plants are not herbivores. And organisms that eat other animals are carnivores, and animals, so where are we? A carnivore that hunts and kills another organism for food is a predator. Organisms that eat both plants and animals, we skipped one, is an omnivore. Animals that a predator hunts and kills are prey. Microorganisms that break down organic matter would be our decomposers. We're learning about an ecological niche, so it's the role an organism plays in the ecosystem. I like to think of it as, if you remove every organism of that species from an ecosystem, what hole does it leave? So that includes its breeding behaviour, that includes where it lives, that includes the waste it produces, it includes what it eats, it includes what eats it. So everything about that is included in its niche. It includes things like the resources that it makes use of. So what light does it need to take in? What temperature, nutritional availment, and its other interactions, like competition predation. So in this example, the microscopic floating producer, I think, would be the algae. The decomposer would be the bacteria. The parasite feeding on the fish scales, where are we? Lice. The small swimming herbivores would be the water fleas, Daphnia. Where are we? The fish-eating bird of prey is the osprey. The medium swimming carnivore would be the brown trout. The rooted underwater producer is a pondweed, and the large predatory carnivore is the pike. Competition. So it's quite a simple concept. If two organisms are requiring the same thing in some way, then they compete. So we can get competition within a species. In, for example, squirrels, red squirrels, for example, all of the males want to mate. So if there is one red squirrel female and 5 red squirrel males, it's natural to assume that they are going to compete with each other, directly or indirectly, to mate with that female. And similarly, in a lot of animal species, the females will compete to find a male. So that is what we call intra-specific. So competition that is within a species is intra-specific, and competition that is between different species is inter-specific. So inter means between, intra kind of means within. Within school, for example, we have an intranet, which is a kind of a shared area that all of the teachers can access. And it's how we can access all your documents, actually. But then there's also the internet, which connects different networks. So intranet, one network, internet, different networks. Interspecific competition is different species that require the same resource and they compete for it. So cows and sheep both need grass, so if they're in one field, they would compete for that resource. Obviously, if they're competing for food, that's quite a strong reason to compete. So it'd be quite a hard form of competition. However, organisms of different species, interspecific competition, they will only overlap in some of their niche. They'll only overlap in some of their needs. Organisms of the same species will overlap in pretty much all of the requirements. So we tend to say that intraspecific, so competition within a species, is much more intense than interspecific. There's an example here in beetles. So species A and B are mixed in an area, and we look at over time the populations of each. So population of A rises over time in this example, and B drops. In this one, populations of A and C both rise as time goes on. So these two don't seem to be competing, and these two do. So what happens to species A and B living together? Give an explanation. So when species A and B live in the same habitat, the population of A rises over time and the population of B decreases over time. This is likely to be due to the fact that they compete for resources and A is a more successful competitor than B. So if you have an area, let's say you have a fox and you have a brown bear, competing for rabbits, I would probably put money on the fact that the brown bear is going to win in most of those competition and most of those fights. So the population of brown bears would rise and the population of foxes would probably decrease. In this one here, these two species are in the same area, but there seems to be no interference in their niche. So as time goes on, both of them, their populations rise. This is probably due to the fact that they are not competing for the same resources. So these two species clearly have overlapping niches and these ones clearly do not. Hopefully that makes sense. You can define all the terms. You can state the ecosystem is community and habitat. You understand the role is so the niche is the role an organism plays in the community. So again, I think of it as the gap they leave if you take them out. The niche relates to all the requirements. Competition happens mostly when resources are in short supply. So if cows and sheep are in the same field, but it's a massive field and there's not a lot of them, then actually there's not going to be a situation where one of them goes up in population density and the other one decreases. Hopefully that makes sense and we understand the two forms, inter and intra-specific competition, and the intra within a species is more strong. Ask your teacher if there's any of that that doesn't make any sense.